Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 312. Today is Sunday the 27th of January 2019, and this interview is with Michael Ventura, who's the founder and CEO of Sub Rosa, a strategy and design practice that believes that meaningful work starts with applied empathy. He's also the author of the book of the same title, Applied Empathy, The New Language of Leadership. Michael works with companies around the world on how to apply empathy to business, specifically focusing on cognitive empathy, and provides a cogent argument to persuade business leaders on why empathy can help drive their business. In this discussion, we discuss how and why to bring cognitive empathy into your business, including a fascinating experience of bringing empathy to the cadets at West Point. Welcome to the Minter Dialogue podcast, where we discuss branding and all things digital. I am Minter Dial, your host, and you'll find the show notes on my eponymous site, minterdial.com. Enjoy the show. So Michael Ventura, I'm so glad to have you on the show. You and I exchanged one of my trips to New York, and I came across you before I met you through all your work at Sub Rosa and your wonderful book called Applied Empathy, The New Language of Leadership. So in your own words, Mike, tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure, and thanks for having the conversation. So I started Sub Rosa about 10 years ago with the premise that doing work with brands and helping organizations grow and learn and evolve certainly needed, but it also needs something that I think was missing in the world, which was this idea of empathy and really perspective taking, getting into the shoes, getting into the mindset of other people, and using that to deeply affect how leadership takes place and also problems get solved. So we built a approach to that and have been applying that with clients in the for-profit and nonprofit sector for about a decade now.
So when you looked at writing the book Applied Empathy, was it sort of the obvious thing it was only about empathy? Because let's say that there's other avenues of thought, which is, well, we could do with some more emotions at work as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of thinking about that. I would say that for us, it is the entry point, but it is not the only point. With our way of solving problems, if we're doing a good job of getting out of our own heads, getting out of our own shoes early in the process, then all the logical side effects of empathy start to emerge, right? One of those side effects might be compassion. One of those side effects might be sympathy, right? And so one of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking with clients about is that we have to define empathy first and foremost, because when people hear it, often they misconstrue it for those side effects, right? They think empathy equals being nicer to each other, or empathy equals being more sympathetic. And while those are often good side effects, they are not empathy unto itself. And so for us, starting with empathy really kind of opens the aperture to find other more opportunistic areas to grow.
To the extent that this is obviously a combined shared passion or topic, yet maybe everyone has a slightly different take on what is empathy and how it's not sympathy and compassion, which sometimes is the conflation that people make about it. So how do you define empathy? And then really specifically, why is it so important for business?
Yeah. So our definition of it is self-aware perspective taking to gain richer and deeper understanding. And while self-aware is a loaded phrase, because certainly one can never be wholly self-aware, and if you are, you're probably not doing marketing services. The idea with it is that, can you be aware enough of your unconscious biases? Can you be aware enough of the tendencies you may have in the process of solving a problem or providing leadership to someone? And can you step outside of those for a period of time? Can you suspend yourself and really see and feel the world from someone else? And the type of empathy we're talking about is cognitive empathy. There are plenty of books and plenty of discourse around what some people call almost a quote unquote feeling into someone else, which is a bit more somatic empathy. You read articles and papers written about how particularly nurses and doctors suffer from what's called now empathy burnout, because they're feeling the emotions of their patients so regularly that it's actually taxing on their own system. And that's not the type of empathy we're talking about. That is a place you can go with this, certainly, and there's pros and cons to working in that way. But for us, it's very difficult to get people to go straight to that. It's not something that everyone has a ability to do. It's not something everybody has a willingness to do. So what we really focus on is cognitive empathy. Can you suspend your own perspective enough to view a situation from the shoes of another and understand their point of view deeply enough that you can use that as an input to your interaction with someone? And so to answer your second question, that's why I think it's really a meaningful tool for business, because what we're talking about from a leadership standpoint is if you can't do that, if you can't see the situation from your colleague or your boss or your team's point of view, or your client's point of view in certain instances, you will be ultimately doing a disservice to them in the interaction.
So when you're dealing with your customers, Michael, you are obviously talking about leadership, and as I try to dissect it in my book, Artificial Empathy, I talk about empathy as something one can do within the company and then without the company towards the stakeholders and customers. To what extent if you had to weigh up, where is the best payoff in terms of upping your empathy, how do you gauge that when you're talking to your customers?
It's a good question. I think it kind of depends to some degree on the job to be done, right? So, for example, a CEO in a multinational is probably spending most of their time managing direct reports and dealing with the internal machinations of the business, right? They're thinking about how each of their direct reports is solving problems, thinking through solutions, and their expectation is often that those direct reports are doing enough of that work externally that they're bringing that view into their solution already, right? So it kind of depends on the role you play. If I'm a chief marketing officer, my job really should be focused on a lot of external perspective taking. What are my consumers? What are my customers? What are my B2B partners? What are my, whatever it might be, wholesalers thinking and talking about and focusing on? And can I make sure that I'm pulling those insights into my own thinking so that my thinking can be as well-rounded and inclusive as possible? So that's sort of the way I've seen it play out most of the time, is that depending on your role, you may need to be more external or more internal, and that may shift depending on the time of day.
And so then, to the extent that you have the external cognitive empathy in place, my line of thinking, because of course I haven't played it out, and you've certainly been in the space longer than I have, which is to what extent you can do empathy externally without it happening and being turned on internally.
Yeah, it's challenging, certainly, because, and sorry, to clarify, do you mean internally within an organization or within oneself?
Within the organization, right?
Okay. So yeah, within the organization, if there is not a appetite for that sort of behavior, right? That sort of perspective taking. If there's a culture that is sort of organized around what we know is best, right? And our thinking is the best thinking. We don't need external perspective. We know what's right and what's wrong. Often those companies don't have a long shelf life, because especially in this day and age where consumers have a realistic expectation that information and brands will meet them on their terms and will communicate with them in a nearly personalized way. Brands that are doing that, brands that are feeling more connected to and empathic toward those consumers, are ultimately the ones that curry the most favor and build the most deep relationships. So if a value is not placed on empathy internally, it's very hard to justify the investment in time externally, because frankly, empathy does slow things down before it speeds them up. you have to have that second conversation. You have to ask that second question. You have to go a little deeper, and maybe the meeting lasts longer, or the interview lasts longer, or the conversation with a customer lasts longer in the beginning, because you're making an extra effort to understand more deeply. But once you get through that and it starts to become a bit more somaticized and part of your own process, that's when the sort of J curve occurs, and you start to accelerate, and the understanding becomes part of your own thinking process, and ultimately speeds things up.
So you have just revealed, if you will, one of the challenges of empathy, which is it does take more time to listen and ask the next question. But as you're going into it, when you're dealing with the C-suite, you say, listen here, you guys, we need to up our ante, I like to call it about, strengthening your empathy muscle. Mm-hmm. What type of resistance do you get? I mean, is it like, oh no, what is this soft shit? We don't need this. We know what we're doing. What type of resistance do you feel with regard to the topic of empathy when you're talking in C-suites? You're mostly based in New York, if I understand correctly.
Our team is based in New York. Our clients are everywhere.
Well, then you're not in North America.
Domestic and internationally.
Okay.
And I would say, we in Asia and in Europe as well. So, I mean, I would say that there are cultural differences too, region to region. But generally speaking, the first thing we get from a skeptic, right, rarely is it neutral. Rarely do we walk in and someone have no opinion or a neutral opinion of empathy. Either they're a proponent of and have found us because of that, or they're a doubter of, but someone else has brought us in to try to be a fire starter on this topic inside the organization. And so the resistance is often, is this about being nicer to people, right? So the first reaction is usually a wrong definition of empathy that has to get unlearned and retaught. The other reaction is, how is this going to impact my business? What's the ROI? What does empathy actually pay off at the end of the day? And so those are usually the two first sort of walls we run into when we're doing this sort of work. Now, the good news is the first one's easy to solve, right? You reset the table, you explain what empathy is and isn't, and much like we started this conversation, when you unpack that it's not about being nice and it's not about those things, it's really just about perspective taking in order to gain deeper understanding. People can co-sign that pretty easily. When you get into what is the ROI, this is where the conversation starts to become more rich, because some of the returns are going to be easily quantifiable in the near term. And again, thinking about this on a time scale, that's really the yardstick that's most effective. So what I mean by that is, you might be able to say that if you understand your consumers more deeply, you will sell your product more effectively to them. And yes, that's likely to be true. You may not see that result for 6 months, because you may have to retool marketing campaigns. You may have to change the way you use social media. You may have to do certain things that actually shift the dialogue and exhibit that empathy before you actually see the net effect of it. There are other things, though, that are often less quantifiable in the near term on an internal basis. So what you find is that teams become more collaborative. They become more higher functioning. Your retention of top talent increases. Your ability to recruit new talent increases, because the sense of understanding and the willingness to put yourself into the shoes of other people starts to breed this different shift in culture that starts to become more inclusive, more collaborative, more inviting. But that doesn't happen overnight, right? That takes practice. That takes recommitment time and time again to this idea in order to see it bear fruit.
And of course, it's rather difficult to make the direct link.
Yeah, exactly. You can't necessarily draw a straight line and say, because we did this 6 months ago, now it looks like this. But what you start to see is smaller points of proof that you can assemble over a period of time and say, okay, look at the retention line on the business. Look at the sales line on the business. Look at this, look at this, look at this. And when you overlay all of those on top of each other and you track that back to when a more empathic process and an empathic leadership style started to be implemented, you can really start to see the correlation.
So have you ever had a situation like this, Mike, where someone says, all right, yeah, all right, I get point one, I get point two, it's going to be good long term, even though I have no idea, wing and repair, I've got 15 minutes, what do I need to do to make our organization more empathic?
Yeah, for sure. It's a very common thing for us. One of the first things that we have to do is teach the ability to listen, right? And unteach the ability for people to do what is most common, particularly in high paced, often pressure cooked C-suite level conversations, which is when someone is talking, you are planning what you want to say. You're not listening, right? You're actually like, you're half listening, but you're really kind of planning your rebuttal, or you're planning your response to whatever it is they're getting into. It's also about teaching and bringing into practice this idea that external points of view should be valued and should be included in the process. And without them, you're really perpetuating an echo chamber where you may all 5-6 of you in the C-suite sit in a room and believe you know the right answer, but what are the external points of view that have been brought into this room to help validate that? And frankly, that is only learned in practice. Most of this stuff is only learned in practice. It's not learned and made successful only by theory. You have to put it in motion and see. And so that's where some organizations stumble, because they may do the half-day training for their leadership team, but then if everyone goes back to business as usual, nothing's going to change. And so having the ability to check back in on them, having the ability to make sure that progress is being made, and to have measurements in place that we can go back to time and again and say, how has this evolved? How has this changed? What have you learned? What's improving? That's really where the rubber meets the road.
So give us an idea of those checks and balances or measurements, because as you say, so many of these, this is a behavioral challenge, and it involves having the time to clean the slate before I listen to what Mike Ventura is telling me. And then it requires me, maybe based on that, what insightful questions should I be asking, which is about helping me understand better what's in Mike Ventura's context, not how I'm going to slap him with my next question or sell him my next product.
Right. So I'll give you an example with a technology company that we've been working with recently. So their mid-tier management rung in the organization, so people who have probably somewhere between 10 and 20 years of experience, who are responsible for leading teams of probably as 300-400 people, perhaps as small as maybe 5 to 10 people, have had a challenge with using empathy, because their responsibilities are, this is that pinch point, that complex pinch point in a lot of organizations, where you're at this level in the organization where you've been given a lot of responsibility, but you don't necessarily have tons of experience with that type of responsibility. You've got a lot of pressure and demands. You're managing up and you're managing down, and so much of the business's success is really highly reliant on your ability to do that well, to go up and go down, to go out and go in. And so one of the things that we're able to do is to actually take a look at performance evaluation criteria, as well as remuneration structures, and figure out, either in the form of peer evaluation or measurable things like employee churn within your team, or retention of clients, or whatever the right metrics are, depending on your organization. How do we put those in place and evaluate them on a quarterly basis, so that you're getting quick real-time feedback? This isn't